One of my role models is a man called Kevin MacLeod. He is a communicator. He's I would say, a preacher, although he doesn't probably realise it. He overflows in the TV programs that he makes with passion. He crafts stories with his team that teach, that move, that entertain. His passion, you probably know, is about architecture. It's about sustainability. It's about restoration. And the various series like Grand Designs that he's involved in actually don't just entertain, but they teach and they challenge people who watch it to appreciate buildings and spaces and their impact on the environment. There are others, challengers, colleagues, other people who make similar kinds of programs. They're really popular. And one of the others actually even calls himself the Restoration Man. These programs are all very well. They're entertaining, there's a positive side, but there's also a dark side, because I think these kinds of programs tap into a temptation we have to be lured into consumption, into thinking the grass is always greener on the other side. That we're tempted to imagine, what if we could upgrade whatever space we live in or add to it? And I think we get tempted into always adding more or changing or spending or consuming, when I think experts will tell us that the greenest, the most sustainable house or space or car or product that you have or could have is the one you already have. Because the cost to you and to the environment of changing, of improving, is actually so high, in not just money terms, but an impact on the environment around you, that maybe we could all do with being just a little bit more content with what we already have. A passion in these programs is restoration. One of the most controversial episodes, actually, in the last series, I think, of the program Grand Designs, was one that was supposed to be about carefully restoring an old mill, but what actually happened was that whole mill, ancient mill, was demolished, and then it had to be rebuilt from scratch, and lots of it were built in the same style, but lots of people were shocked, because this wasn't what restoration was supposed to be all about. As passionate as people like Kevin MacLeod are about buildings, about sustainability, about restoration, it seems to me that the writer of a book in this collection of books that we call the Bible is just as passionate about another project and about a person called Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, who represents a restoration project that is actually much bigger than an awful lot of people understand, and certainly bigger than an old mill. This ancient writer we've been looking at in a story that we call Luke collects together accounts of about 3 years in the life and death and resurrection of a man called Jesus of Nazareth. And as Jesus of Nazareth wanders around in the north of his country, he's provoking a reaction, he's drawing crowds. And in chapter 7, Luke tells us that the crowds get bigger and bigger. And then Jesus comes to a place called Nain, a tiny village, which is about, we think, 5 or 6 miles from Nazareth, from where Jesus comes from. In Jewish culture, the centre of the village, if you like, was actually at the gate to the town. That's where the markets happened. That's where the social life of the community happened. And as Jesus approached this area in the town, he meets another crowd. In actual fact, it's a procession. It's a funeral procession. I actually was part of a funeral just this last week, and the custom in so many places around here is for the hearse, the vehicle with the coffin in it, to leave wherever the funeral is, and then for a short while or a longer while to go slowly while other people walk behind it. It's become a wee bit more significant that in our current times, due to the restrictions around how many people can meet together, it's allowed more people to be involved. In Jesus' day, there would have been much more fuss and much more noise than a typical northeast of Scotland funeral. Every ancient Jewish funeral ceremony would have paid mourners, people who were paid to make a noise, a lot of noise, to wail, to scream, maybe to tear their clothes. We might find that a bit strange, but if you imagine for a minute that there are these groups of people making so much noise and moving around and stuff, I wonder if it actually would make it easier for those who were overcome with grief themselves just to let it out in the middle of all that instead of having so much attention drawn to them. The dead body was carried in this procession on a wooden plank or stretcher. It was known as a bier. And the body would not be in a coffin, it would be wrapped, ready to be treated later at the burial site. In this case, this procession is layered with extra tragedy. Luke lets us know that the dead person is young, a boy. He's the only son of a widow. So that means that this woman has already suffered the loss of her husband, and now the loss of her son. And not only that, her only son. Let's think for a wee moment about an ancient Jewish society. In that society, the only way to make a living, basically, was centered around men. Men owned land, men owned the businesses, men had the voice, men supported their families. So the whole system was weighted towards husbands and sons. So for this woman, without a husband or a son, this woman faced poverty. And if that wasn't enough, with the death of her son, this is the end of a family line as well. And for a Jewish family, that is an extra level of tragedy. No wonder there's such a large crowd of people in this procession. Jesus meets this procession, and Luke wants us to know his first reaction is what we would call compassion. His heart went out to her. And then he speaks to her directly. Please don't cry. This compassion, this reaction, this saying, don't cry, don't be afraid, is a theme. It's like a chorus, it's like a harmony that comes back in time and time again, a theme in Luke's stories. That this story is about a God of compassion, about a man, Jesus of Nazareth, who puts that compassion on show, full of this compassion. After he speaks, Jesus then does something, and in actual fact, it's a tiny detail in the story, but it's actually possibly the most surprising and shocking part of the story. And it's no surprise that the people carrying this wooden stretcher with the body on it stop dead in their tracks. And that's because in the Jewish religious system, dead bodies meant ritual pollution. Any contact with dead bodies meant you couldn't be part of worship for a while. You couldn't be part of society for a while. You had to go through a kind of a quarantine procedure and certain rituals at the temple before you could rejoin. So the last thing Jesus should be doing as a Jewish man and as a Jewish teacher is to touch the stretcher or the body on it. But he does. And this isn't the only story that Luke tells us about Jesus touching a person who has some sort of condition or problem. Earlier, it was a man with leprosy, and Jesus laid his hands on that man, and instead of Jesus being infected by that condition, it's like the opposite happened. It's like the power, the healing within Jesus infected the man and restored him and put things to rights. Here, the third thing Jesus does after full of compassion speaking and then touching the wooden stretcher is that he speaks again, and he speaks directly to the dead young man. He says, very simple command, get up. The man gets up and begins to speak. And Luke wants us to know that this is a real resuscitation. This man is no longer dead. He can be active. He can speak. And then Luke includes that little phrase that Jesus restores him to his mother. Interesting language. Remember that none of Luke's words are here by accident. This is crafted, this is inspired. This is a story about a young man brought back to life, but it's about far more than that. Because that happens in the story, but it seems to me this story is far more about the woman. She's the one we hear most about. She is the widow. She has lost her only son. She's the one that Jesus has compassion to. She's the one who he speaks to directly, and she is the one who is restored. And that word's not there by accident. Just like the man who Jesus met with leprosy wasn't just healed of a skin condition, he was restored to his family, to social life, to worship, to village life, to be a useful part of the society. This woman is in this act restored to a fuller life, She can be who she was made to be. She has a family again. She can be part of a supportive unit in the village, and she can continue the family line. And in that phrase, there's even more going on, even more layers, typical of a Jewish story. Because a Jewish listener would recognize that these stories about Jesus are echoes of stories they would have heard as children about men known as the prophets. People who had powerful messages from God that challenged or comforted the society of the time. And Luke knows that his telling of this story echoes stories about prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And their stories are collected for us in books called Kings. One of the stories about Elijah, where a child is returned to life, has this exact phrase. What does Elijah do then? He restores that boy to his mother. Exactly the same phrase. Brilliant. These are stories. Luke's not subtle at all, of restoration. These are stories about this man, Jesus, doing, living out, putting into practice, hands-on, his announcement earlier on in the stories. Look at Luke chapter 4, about what God was about, that this was about and has always been about good news for the poor and the outsider. This restoration project is bigger than anyone realized. Not just about illness, about even dealing with death itself. And Luke tells us on purpose stories about the poor and stories about the outsider and about healing and about restoration, because that is the project. Because that is what the God of compassion is doing and always has been doing. And Jesus of Nazareth is putting that on show in flesh and blood, right in the heart of the action, hands on. Which is why Luke finishes by letting us know how the crowd responds. They respond by recognizing this is the same God at work. This is the God who's been working through their prophets. And they say, God has come to help his people. Literally, their words mean God has visited. God is here. God is present in Jesus of Nazareth. There's a phrase we hear a lot, especially at Christmas time for that. And that phrase is Emmanuel. It means God with us. And there's a meal we celebrate together regularly, a meal that Jesus gave his followers with that image of presence at the center. Another word for that presence, of that being with us, is the word communion. It's something we're given to celebrate and something we're given to respond to. So just like the crowd, just like Luke's listeners, just like the woman, just like the man with his condition of leprosy, let's meet with this Jesus of Nazareth, and let's also respond together.